Secretary Pearl, there are two studies that apparently are significant and important. The Cadre study that's been referred to and the Palomar study that hasn't been referred to. At best, we would hope they could be released to the public. At the very minimum, we would hope they could be made available to members of Congress who have a top secret rating. Can you give us some assurance that these will be made available at least to the Congress and hopefully made public?
I'm not familiar. I have not read either study. Frankly, I'd like to read them first. We do have some limited pride of authorship, even though we're a bureaucracy, and if the Cadre study is as superficial and inadequate as I am informed it is, I think we'd be embarrassed to release it.
The Palomar study, too.
The Palomar study I'm not familiar with at all, but let me say we are not going to suppress the view of some officer who may have written some opinion that differs from the opinion of the administration. There are plenty of other people who can give expression to all of those views, and we enjoy the debate. And the suggestion that we are somehow suppressing dissident ideas about the implications of nuclear winter is just fundamentally wrong and unfair.
Well, judging from your performance this morning, you're well equipped and well qualified to cope with any debate that's likely to come in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Snyder?
Thank you, sir.
Secretary Pearl, are you of the opinion that the information that has been included in the DoD report ought to be expanded to incorporate some biological, agricultural, and societal impact studies?
Well, let me say, I'm not sure I think it is vital to the decisions that the government has to make to explore every last physical phenomenon associated with nuclear war. We are well persuaded that nuclear war would be terribly destructive. Mm-hmm. And whether it is a bottomless pit for research, given the inability to conduct experimental research, mm-hmm. to speculate on all of the horrifying consequences of such a war.
One of the questions...
So I have no objection in principle to it, but it's not at all clear to me that this would be a useful investment of limited research resources.
One of the questions that this science committee so often is required to ask is that in the pursuit of answers to scientific questions or looking for scientific answers, we have to recognize when is enough research. And obviously our discussions on acid rain have pretty much concluded. We've been doing plenty of research, yet the administration is asking for more money for additional research, and oftentimes it is perceived that this might be a way of saying, well, we just want to keep on researching it because we don't want to take any mitigating measures. I think there is concern among many members of Congress, and I certainly appreciate your comment. We can spend lots and lots of money researching this thing, but at what point and what information will be necessary to change the attitude and the policies of the administration and those who are sitting in this body?
But you see, there again, there's the presumption that if we only understood the phenomenon, if we only realized the circumstances under which a nuclear winter would occur, we would change our policies, which mm-hmm. implies that the policies are an inappropriate response to the prospects of a horrible nuclear war, and I don't believe they are. You've mm-hmm. been begging the question, all of you. I heard you say earlier that we have a view of warfare, the more weapons the better. I don't know whose view that is. That's not the view of the Department of Defense. Well, then certainly not my view.
Why in the constant debates before the Armed Services Committee and the debates on the floor are we shown charts by members of the leadership here in this body saying this is how many submarines the Soviets have and this is how many the submarines the United States should have in order to keep up with the Joneses? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the kind of mentality that is working among the decision makers now, and I think that I agree with you that that is a frightful way to be making, and a very uneconomical way to be making decisions as to what our deterrent posture ought to be.
But it's not how we do it. I mean,
it is how we do it here.
It may be that there are charts showing the relative forces on each side, but when we make a decision to develop a weapon or to procure a weapon, it is not because the Soviets have the same weapon or because they have them in larger numbers. The Soviets have vastly more air defenses than the United States. 13,000 launchers for surface-to-air missiles. We don't have a system like that, haven't even begun one, nor do we have any intention of doing so. So I think it's wrong to suggest that we are keeping up with the Joneses. I really believe that trivializes the very difficult problem we have in planning our strategic forces. And most of what we are now doing represents the replacement of obsolete systems that were deployed 20 and 25 years ago that are nearing the end of their useful operational life.
Well, let me get back to my original line of questioning. Your budget for the Department of Defense this past year has been $1.5 million, and it is slated for an increase of $2.5 million in '86. Whether that occurs or not remains to be seen. There are many of us that are looking at straight across the board freezes, including this area. I'm curious to know whether or not, seeing you question the need for continued research, is that kind of increase warranted? Do you believe?
Yes, I think there is a lot that we don't know, and I'm sure Dr. Sagan would acknowledge that there is a lot that we don't know about the phenomena that he's, in general terms, described. And we need to know more. What are the washout consequences of moisture in the atmosphere? How do different materials with different properties burn, and under what circumstances do they burn? How does the weather at the time of the war affect the calculation, and so forth? Now, at the end of the day, there's still going to be very sizable uncertainty. I don't think there's any question about that, but we ought to do what we can to narrow the uncertainties that now exist. All that has been determined thus far, in my judgment, is that at some level of nuclear exchange, there may well be climatic effects, and we take that very seriously. But I want to assure you we took very seriously the prospect of hundreds of millions of deaths even before we knew about nuclear winter.
You want to go ahead and ask it? Go ahead.
You ask him. You ask him.
Well, we are collaborating here, questioning how the attitude of that seriousness is reflected in the report.
Well, I think the report is a good report. It is a report intended to be read, for one thing, and we could have sent you 800 or 900 pages, which is the typical bureaucratic way to do it, and nobody would have read it, probably not even the staffs. It's a readable report. I think it's a fair and accurate report, and with respect to the implications of the nuclear winter phenomenon, I don't think the length of the report is the standard by which we should judge whether the issues have been identified. Mm-hmm. I realize there is disappointment that we did not, at the conclusion of this report, say we are going to abandon our historic attitude toward the construction of our strategic forces and the nature of our deterrent and our approach to arms control. I'm sorry about that. We couldn't satisfy you on that count. But that's because we believe that what we are doing with respect to our strategic force posture and arms control is basically sound. And it is made no less sound by the recognition that there are phenomena beyond those we already understood that would make a nuclear war even more horrible than we had already anticipated.
Well said. Thank you very much, Mr. Pearl. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wirth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Pearl, as you know, this amendment grew out of a seminar which Congressman Gingrich and I sponsored for Mr. Teller and Mr. Sagan to come and talk to a large number of members of Congress. And I will speak to Congressman Gingrich, but let me in advance invite you and Dr. Sagan to come back, and maybe we could get the two of you together with that, because I think the implications of this discussion that we've had today are very significant, and ones that many members should have the benefit of. I might also suggest that when you talk about the Cadre study, it's my understanding that the General Accounting Office had done a preliminary look at the Cadre study, had agreed that it was not a particularly distinguished piece of work. I would hope we might get your analysis of that back, as has been requested before, as well as an analysis and understanding as to what the Palomar study was and why that was not included in the report that came back to the Congress on the 1st of March. Also, you might have your staff send to us, if you might, the actual facts on the dollars expended in all of this. There seems to be some debate about that, which you raised earlier, saying that, in fact, a certain amount of money was spent. Science Magazine had a different outline of that. Science had suggested, as best the story can be pieced together, George Keyworth, the President's science advisor, first sought to extract roughly $5 million in new funds entirely from DOD, and it goes on to say that that money was not forthcoming. I think we'd like to just have a picture of who was doing what.
Simply a question of who pays the bills. You know, everybody thinks you can come to the DOD and tap into our budget.
And the question was
the
how
FY86 proposal is $5.5 million total on an interagency basis. $2.5 million of that will come from the Defense Department, $5 million of it from the Defense Department and the Department of Energy together. So we are, in fact, funding the burden of this. And, I must say in this connection that I think this money will be well spent by competent scientific personnel.
I'm not debating that.
Able to make the measurements that we're talking about, and I resent, I'm sorry I neglected to mention this earlier, the implication that the only independent scientists are university scientists. You know, there are a lot of things that affect one's scientific judgment other than who pays your salary.
Dr. Pearl, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your perspective on that, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. I have a limited amount of time, and I do want to get on the record, you know, who is paying for what and how much is being committed. Let me go to the thrust of my questioning, which relates not to the uncertainty of the science. I think you and I should leave that to the scientists, but to the policy implications of nuclear winter. What concerned me in the report that we received from the Department of Defense was, on the one hand, agreeing that nuclear winter as a phenomena was a valid scientific concept. We're going to hear more specifically about that in later witnesses this morning. What concerned me, however, was the unwillingness or apparently non-recognition that there might well be other implications that came out of the concept of nuclear winter. And let me give you three that you know, I think I understand. One, the notion of survivability. That has been a concept which has been advocated by members of this administration and previous administrations, that in fact there was such a thing as a survivable nuclear war. If the concept of nuclear winter is valid, what are the implications of that for the concept of survivability? Secondly, targeting, which has been referred to. I think the situation is more ambiguous than the one that anybody has suggested today. Maybe one can come out and say that there are no implications whatsoever. On the other hand, you can't say, I think, as the report from the Department of Defense suggests, that there is no targeting of urban areas. I mean, you know and I know that that is not the case. A third concept, it seems to me, that ought to be examined in the light of the nuclear winter issue is the notion of a first strike. We hear an enormous amount of rhetoric and discussion over the last years, particularly in the debate on the MX missile, about what is first strike, what is not first strike. If nuclear winter is a valid scientific concept, does that or does it not make bankrupt the notion of first strike? That first strike, in effect, would be suicide. Consequently, we should not base a number of our targeting and other initiatives on the concept of first strike. There are a variety of implications of nuclear winter that break into the discussion of arms control, suggest different implications, which I think it is our responsibility and yours to wrap our heads around as best possible.
Let me just say that I think it is very difficult to go from the conclusion that nuclear winter is a valid concept to the conclusion that how one conducts or how one responds to a first strike or how one targets or one does not target or the issue of survivability, how we will reflect on that as a consequence of the concept. Because the concept, without diminishing the uncertainty, the quantitative uncertainty, isn't a very helpful guide. It can point you in a direction. It points us in the direction, reinforces the direction of withholding weapons from urban targets. It points us in the direction of seeking forces that are survivable in the face of a Soviet first strike capability. It pushes us in the direction of recognizing that a nuclear war, whether one survived it or not, would entail tremendous and unacceptable destruction. Obviously, it's tautological that when you refer to the nuclear winter concept, if what you mean is that there will be a nuclear winter as a consequence of any nuclear war, and that that nuclear winter will extinguish life on Earth, then I don't think you have to be a genius to draw the appropriate conclusion about survivability. You're not going to survive. But when you talk about the circumstances under which a nuclear winter would be triggered, and how we and the Soviets, because we have to do this in a sense together, might ameliorate the situations, minimize the situations in which that would occur, that's a far more difficult proposition, and you can't answer that question simply by accepting the concept, because you've got to have some quantitative sense as well.
Clearly, the thrust of this hearing is not to say, yes, nuclear winter is bad, nobody disagrees with that the consequences would be devastating. What we're trying to suggest is that if nuclear winter as a concept is valid, then that has a number of implications, which you're suggesting in your answer now. That has a number of implications for first strike. That has a number of implications for survivability and different kinds of survivability, which I would suggest to you are not addressed in the report. Now, as the author of the amendment requiring the report, it is my responsibility to make sure, as best I can, that the administration fulfills what the Congress asked it to do. And it seems to me that there are a variety of implications in this which are not addressed, which are conceptual policy in nature, do not deal with the uncertainties of the science, do not deal with a number of the other issues that have been brought up here, but are ones of the how are we dealing with various implications of this for such issues, again, as targeting first strike and so on. Those are not sketched out. Some are not even referred to in the report.
Well, if we've omitted a topic here
or variety,
there,
it's
because we wrote our report and you didn't write our report, and you want us to write your report, and we
no,
would be
there are a
glad
variety
to go
of things.
back.
I would just suggest to you there are a variety of things, Secretary Pearl, in the amendment itself, language in the amendment, for example, of biological agricultural consequences, which are not addressed in the report. I would just say to you, I don't want to point a finger or be confrontational about this. I just think this is terribly important. A number of members think that this is terribly important, and would hope that it would not be treated, in an offhanded fashion. And I know that you don't intend to do that.
If we have omitted points, we would be glad to go back and try to address those points. But the main point I wish to make is that the nuclear winter phenomenon parallels, in terms of its implications, our understanding of the devastating consequences of a nuclear war before nuclear winter was ever discovered, and therefore much of what we are doing and much of what we have thought about is only reinforced by the discovery of nuclear winter and does not run counter to it. And I could comment, if you wished, on survivability, on targeting, and on first strike, but it would all be in the same vein, that because of the consequences of a nuclear war absent a nuclear winter, we think we are doing the right thing with respect to targeting, and we think our attitude toward diminishing the Soviet incentive to strike first is an essentially sound attitude. On the biological consequences, again, I think one can carry this too far. And to attempt, when we are not even sure, can't be sure, about the circumstances under which there would be climatic changes, to do an elaborate assessment of the biological consequences of climatic changes seems to me to miss the point. The point is, we are persuaded in the first instance that a nuclear war would be a terrible thing. And we believe we have designed the policies as best we can, and it's an imperfect world, to minimize the likelihood of that war taking place. And understanding better the biological consequences of a period of protracted low temperature would not, in my judgment, alter our efforts to make the world safer and avoid that nuclear war. But if you insisted that we do that kind of research, of course, we'll do it. We try to be responsive to the Congress. But I don't think it has policy implications of the kind that the recognition that there is a phenomenon like nuclear winter has in the first instance. So I think it's a variation on a theme and not fundamental to what you and we are both interested in.
Well, I would thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would think that it's our responsibility in the Congress to define what we think are the fundamental questions to be asked, and we'll come back to you on that. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Okay. Congressman Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, there seems to be the general conception in the committee that the Department of Defense or the government or government agencies are doing nothing in that research, yet I have before me a press release out of Los Alamos, just dated March the 1st, that talks about the nuclear winter being worse in the summer if it were to come about at that time, and the consequences would be different if we have, depending on the amount of rainfall that we have. So it seems to me like there is ongoing research by the Department of Defense on the effects of the nuclear winter. My problem is this, that we can understand all of those disastrous effects, but that leads us to the conclusion that we ought to avoid the war to begin with so that we're not concerned with the disastrous effects. And from what I see of administration policy, detente is, or deterrence rather, is one way to do it. Arms control, the President's stated objective of 0 weapons on both sides, if that could come about. SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, certainly to immobilize, to make inoperative any weapons that might come along. That certainly are steps that go towards saying we don't want the effects of nuclear winter to ever present themselves. Seems to me like we're in a good direction. Are there other things besides deterrence, arms control, as are now going on, SDI proposals? Are there other things that we can do to eliminate the threat of nuclear war completely? I think that's the way we ought to be going.
Well, I agree with you entirely. One of the things that we are doing, as I indicated earlier, is making reductions in the size of the force and in the megatonnage of the force. And as the accuracy of weapons improves, I think we ought to be able to move further in that direction. And when accuracy becomes quite perfect, we may be able to substitute some non-nuclear for nuclear weapons. Now, that is something that we are very keen to do if we can find ways in which to do it. We have to press on, as you've indicated, with the effort to get the kind of arms control that brings about serious reductions. And the kind we've had in the past hasn't done that, and that brings us to the parlous situation we now find ourselves in. So we have knowingly, willingly, and with our eyes open set a standard for arms control that is far more demanding than has ever been set before. And it's going to make it a lot tougher to get an agreement. But if we get an agreement, it may help solve this nuclear winter problem, because the agreements we got in the past didn't help it at all.
Exactly, exactly. What I gathered from what Dr. Sagan said is that verification is going to be an impossibility, and that we ought to get a warehouse where, you bring them in and then dismantle them and put them into power plants. Do you believe that verification is an unreachable goal?
I think it's difficult to answer that question in the abstract, although Dr. Sagan characterized our view as saying that arms control was impossible because of verification. I don't hold that view at all. I think the limits on our ability to verify, together with the Soviet record of violations of existing agreements, suggests that we should be very cautious with respect to some limitations where a little bit of cheating would go a very long way. But in the main, we have put forward proposals that we think are adequately verifiable.
This committee is involved, of course, in research and the new technologies and all those sorts of things, although we don't do the Department of Defense funding. It would seem to me like that funding of verifiable or verification technology should be very high on our agenda, because perhaps we won't be able to have a general on site seeing where the targeting is, but at least if we have some new technology or existing technology to be able to verify something.
I think, if I may say so, the idea that emerged in your earlier exchange with Dr. Sagan, that the Soviets, how do we prove to the Soviets, how do we verify that we do not target their cities, seems to me to miss the point. The point is, it is not in our interest to target Soviet cities. It wasn't in our interest to target Soviet cities before the discovery of nuclear winter. If one takes nuclear winter seriously, it is even less in our interest today to target Soviet cities, And I think the Soviets are likely to be persuaded by the logic of the situation and not by what we say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Huckabee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Pearl, Dr. Sagan has suggested earlier the possibility of a joint high-level scientific study with the Russians to study the effects of a nuclear winter. Would you be in favor of this or opposed?
If Dr. Andrei Sakharov represented the Soviet side, I would be 100% in favor of it. But if the Soviets are going to send over to participate in a study like that, scientists who may or may not be associated with the KGB, scientists who are under instructions to come to certain conclusions and not others, and to follow the party line, then I don't think one can expect a fruitful scientific exchange. And it seems to me that as long as Dr. Sakharov is kept in the exile he's kept in, we have every right to be deeply suspicious about Soviet science and Soviet scientific exchange.
So you're saying you don't think a scenario would exist where you would favor such a study today?
I don't think we can expect to get objective and therefore useful results under the current circumstances of Soviet manipulation of scientific data for their own purposes.
Do you think we should be sharing all the data that we are acquiring and hopefully we will acquire in the coming years with the Soviets regarding nuclear weapons?
Absolutely. In the absence of an exchange, the Soviets are perfectly competent to evaluate our results. And I believe it's important that the Soviets be as well informed as possible about the nuclear winter phenomenon. It's obviously in our interest that they not, failing to recognize it, behave in a manner that brings it on. So I think we ought to make our research results available to the Soviet Union. But you don't need a highly politicized cooperative program in order to do that. The Soviets are, in fact, in my view, better able to evaluate our research when they can do it privately than in the context of an exchange program where they're forced to strike certain poses and attitudes for political reasons.
You've spoken earlier of arms reduction and this administration's goal to achieve arms reductions, yet problems with reducing to zero. At what level would you like to see both sides at?
Well, I believe that if we could get to zero, we would by no means have solved the defense problem, because non-nuclear forces would continue to exist. And we would obviously have a very serious verification problem, because the presence of even a few weapons surreptitiously retained would have an impact comparable to the impact of the first and only possession of nuclear weapons as it emerged in our hands in the closing days of World War II. For this reason, I believe that we can only hope to achieve a stable, complete nuclear disarmament if both sides have deployed defenses so that any violation of the terms of that agreement might be met by adequate defensive forces.
Wouldn't it make more sense to significantly reduce and then proceed with a Star Wars type defense for both sides rather than trying to proceed with a Star Wars defense while both sides have overwhelming numbers?
But that's not what we're doing. We're proceeding with a program of research parallel to a Soviet program of research, and no decision has been made, nor could any intelligent decision now be made to proceed with the deployment of a defensive system. I don't know what the results of the research are going to be, but our approach to the Soviets in Geneva now is to begin the process of deep reductions. We won't get deep reductions. There's not a prayer we will get deep reductions if the burden of opinion in this country and in the Congress in particular is that we ought to settle for shallow reductions, because the Soviets would much rather give us shallow reductions. Their proposals are for shallow reductions. If we don't get deep reductions, we're not going to begin to attack the problem of nuclear winter. So I hope you'll bear with us while we try to get an agreement that is going to be difficult to extract from the Soviet side.
Speaking of reductions, the intermediate proposals in Europe, I think you stated that this administration had proposed the total elimination of all intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe. Does this include the French and the British? I thought that was the hang-up.
No, I don't believe that was the hang-up, although I mean, I'm prepared to take the time, if you're able to take the time to discuss that issue in detail. We propose the elimination of U.S. and Soviet intermediate nuclear weapons.
Say that a little bit louder.
We proposed the elimination of U.S. and Soviet intermediate nuclear ballistic missiles and cruise missiles in the INF negotiations. The Soviets claimed that they could not accept this proposal because of the presence of a very modest number of British and French forces that we neither control nor have any responsibility for or authority over. The Soviets knew we were in no position to dispose of the forces of the British and French. And so it was a showstopper, and I believe they knew that. And I believe that any objective assessment of their negotiating behavior in Geneva prior to the walkout makes it very plain that there was only one outcome that they were prepared to agree to, and that was the abandonment by the United States alone, unilaterally, of the NATO plan to deploy cruise missiles. And
Were they willing to reduce to
Pershing
the
II.
same level as to what the British and the French have equivalent?
they said that they were prepared to reduce to the same level in a manner that would have left the United States with zero, and that calculated the British and French forces in a self-serving and unreasonable way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congresswoman Myers.
You mentioned, Mr. Pearl, that we had significantly reduced the number of warheads in our arsenal, and would you elaborate on that a little bit? What have we reduced, and when did we do it?
Well, we've done it rather consistently since the peak was reached in 1967, and the reductions have been brought about by the replacement of older weapons with new weapons, in which the older weapons were retired and in many cases replaced with a smaller number of similar weapons, or in some cases we simply abandoned that type of weaponry altogether. So the end result has been a reduction of 8,000 in the years since 1967, and a reduction in the megatonnage of that smaller residual force by three-quarters. We have 1/4 today of the megatonnage that we had in the 1960s. Now, there are people who will immediately turn around and say, but our weapons now are far more effective, and of course they are. It's the increased effectiveness that has permitted the reduction to come about, which is one of the reasons why we've never been very enthusiastic about a nuclear freeze. And it seems to me a nuclear freeze is inconsistent with the effort to reduce by enabling a smaller and more effective force to provide the same deterrent capability. So it's been a consistent pattern of reductions. In Canada, at a meeting of defense ministers in October of 1984, it was agreed that a further 1,400 weapons would be withdrawn from Europe. Most of those will be dismantled. In fact, I think they'll all be dismantled. So the number continues to go down, but not on the Soviet side.
Yield back.
Congressman Udall.
Secretary Pearl, Mrs. Myers seems to be talking either about build down or a close relative of build down. Is that correct?
Well, I think the
I
question...
think what I'm trying to get at, I was surprised at the 8,000 figure, that we actually have 8,000 less warheads or less launchers or less something.
Less warheads.
Less warheads. Has that been a process of modernization? Can you briefly tell me how?
It has been the consequence of the process of modernization. Look, you talked earlier in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, about the 1950s, which was an interesting period. In the 1950s, I think it's fair to say that this country went on a nuclear binge and built every conceivable weapon in a nuclear version. I believe that was a mindless policy, and when it was evaluated toward the end of the 1950s, and in particular in the early 1960s, it was abandoned, and we have since the late 1960s been reducing the number of nuclear weapons, partly because we recognized that we had overdone it in the 1950s, and it was not necessary to possess nuclear weapons on that scale. I think we can go much further in that process. But if I could take a second of my time, you made one remark about the 1950s that I can't help commenting on, because it's an indication of how often the standard image is wrong, if I may say so. In the 1950s, and I was stunned to learn this myself, when our nuclear deterrent force consisted entirely or virtually entirely of B-47 bombers and a very large number of bombs, that's where some of these reductions have come from, virtually the entire American arsenal of nuclear bombs was located at 2 military installations, one in Spokane, Washington, and one at Limestone, Maine. And had the Soviet Union preemptively attacked those 2 air bases, this enormous deterrent capability of the United States, a capability that probably could have produced a nuclear winter, would have been destroyed on the ground, and we would have had no nuclear retaliatory capability. And we didn't know it until the end of midway through the period, as a result of some pioneering work done at the RAND Corporation, we discovered the vulnerability of our strategic force. You've got to pay attention to that.
Could you give us for the record, or maybe it's in the statement you had, some detail on this 8,000 figure, where, in what categories it occurred? I think it's an important subject, and I'd like to see it pursued.
Yes, I think we can.
Let me close with the commenting on what you just said, the 1950s. The thing that shocked me and that I was referring to in the statement is that if we knew nothing about this nuclear winter idea, none of us in the 1950s. We knew that blast was bad, and we knew that radiation was bad, and that grave damage could be done to the planet in any event. We now find that there's another, probably or possibly another effect that's equally bad to destroy the planet, and maybe worse in some ways. But we wouldn't have as a country, but we could have theoretically made a first strike thinking that all the damage would have been in the Soviet Union, that the radiation might reach us through global currents and all of the rest. But we could have had the power to commit suicide, in effect, national suicide, without knowing that that power was in our hands. And I think that's one of the things that worries the nuclear winter people perhaps the most. Reminds me of the story of the woman, the wealthy woman, said to her driver in the limousine, "Drive off the cliff, George, I want to commit suicide." And it seems to me that this is an aspect of that this is the thing that's new about nuclear winter.
It reminds me of that scene in a W.C. Fields movie where he's about to be hanged, and the hangman says, "Do you have any last comment to make?" And he says, "Yes, this is going to be a great lesson to me." No, I think your point is well taken. We are perfectly capable of doing stupid things because we're not fully aware of the consequences of our acts. It is not our policy. It is not our policy to plan for, prepare for, or carry out a first nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. And it wasn't in the 1950s either. And we stood by, even in the days of our nuclear monopoly, and watched the Soviets do a lot of disagreeable things without ever availing ourselves of that,
Well, that's quite
unique
comforting, but
capability.
why don't we, in that case, why don't we sign the pledge of no first use that's been argued about over the years? The Soviets say we've signed it, why don't you?
Well, first of all, we take pledges seriously, and when we sign them, we feel bound to act upon them. So we would have to change our policy. Our present policy is that in the event that we are unable to defend the NATO alliance in Europe with conventional forces, we retain the right to introduce nuclear forces into the conflict. Gratuitously, to remove that uncertainty that the Soviets must face would weaken the quality of our deterrent capability in Europe and expose us, in view of the Soviet preponderance in conventional forces, to an increased risk of conflict. And for that reason, we don't think it accomplishes very much.
Do our NATO allies still want us not to make such a statement or sign
Yes,
such a statement?
I believe they want us to stand with our current position. And our Gang of Four was answered by a European Gang of Four, I thought, rather persuasively.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman McCain.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Sagan was unable to answer the question that I had, and I request that he be allowed to answer for the record as to whether he believes the United States should embark on unilateral reductions of nuclear weapons if negotiations are a failure. So I request that he be allowed to answer that for the record.
Without objection.
Yeah, well, without objection, the record will be open for any member to address questions to any of the witnesses or the panelists for inclusion in the
Thank you,
record.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Pearl, for, as always, a very eloquent testimony. You know, I'm also glad you brought up this very unfortunate aspect of what is a very important debate, and that is impugning the motives, the dedication to freedom and peace throughout the world of individuals who are taking opposite viewpoint. And I might say I think it's very much beneath Dr. Sagan and the outstanding reputation that he enjoys in this country to impugn the motives, the dedication to world peace, and the prevention of nuclear war by our President and our negotiating team in Geneva at this time. I believe that this debate is demeaned by doing that, and I believe that it's important that this issue debated on its merits and demerits rather than the motives of the individuals involved, which I don't believe that any of us are able to ascertain. My question to you is it indeed true that the Soviet Union has embarked on an SDI of their own?
Yes, it is now, and it has been, and that program began to gather momentum after the signature of the ABM Treaty of 1972. The Soviets were the first, as far as we know, to engage seriously in directed energy research, in high-powered laser research. They have an active program. They have the only anti-ballistic missile system deployed anywhere in the world today, and they are actively working on it to improve it. They have deployed, as you know, a large phased array radar in clear violation of the ABM Treaty in order to complete the nationwide coverage of the Soviet Union with a long-range radar. They are deploying air defense systems that we believe have significant ABM potential. In short, they have a vigorous program at all levels of science and technology. They're investing sizable sums in it. You know, 10 days after the President gave his speech in April of 1983 on the American Strategic Defense Program, there appeared an open letter in Pravda, reprinted a number of other places as well, signed by a very large number of Soviet scientists. And in this letter, they deplored the perversion of science for the purpose of building the weapons of war. And they also expressed the view, which we've heard a couple of times here this morning, that SDI couldn't possibly work. Well, we took this list of Soviet signers and we sent it over to the CIA and we said, can you look through your files and tell us what you know about these fellows, if anything? And they weren't able to identify all of them, but they were able to identify about half. And among the half they were able to identify is the fellow running the Soviet SDI program, the man who designed the Moscow ABM system, the designer of the Soviet SS-18 ballistic missile, the designer of the Soviet Typhoon-class submarine program, and I could go on, because every one of the fellows we were able to identify, with a couple of exceptions, is up to his eyeballs in military research and development. So the Soviet position on this is built on a really breathtaking hypocrisy.
Well, to carry a comment you made earlier a little further, the next time we seek a joint project of scientific cooperation with the Soviet Union, particularly where it entails anything to do with nuclear or strategic weaponry, I think we ought to insist on the presence of Dr. Sakharov. I don't know of anyone who would be more qualified in the Soviet Union to partake in one of these joint studies. Do you?
I don't, and I must say I have been impressed with the degree to which the American scientific community has rallied around Dr. Sakharov, and I am concerned that that resolve to make the Soviet scientific community pay enough of a penalty so that Dr. Sakharov will be protected, that resolve may be weakening. I hope it's not.
Thank you. Isn't it true that the Soviet Union continues to develop and produce in an unabated fashion, chemical and biological weapons of war?
There is no question the Soviets maintain a very sizable arsenal of chemical weapons. They train in the administration of those weapons. It's an impressive program. They take it seriously.
Perhaps then we should have a study concerning the possible effect on the world of the unleashing of those weapons. Would you recommend that as well?
I think I would be inclined first to see whether we have already done analyses of that kind. There is no doubt in my mind that tremendous damage could be inflicted with chemical and biological weapons, and the biological weapons are a truly frightening prospect. Whether we need to do original research, I don't know, but we could certainly pull together what we think we know.
Finally, the Soviet Union is installing new leadership. Do you have any optimism about the possibilities for agreements between ourselves and the Soviet Union, particularly as regards to arms reductions with the new Soviet leadership, or do you see that it's just business as usual?
Well, I think it is almost certainly the case that Mr. Gorbachev has for some months now been a significant influence on Soviet policy. Whether the Soviets in this round of negotiations will demonstrate a greater willingness to negotiate toward significant reductions, I simply don't know. It remains to be seen. I know this: they won't do it unless they believe that they cannot get away with a kind of agreement that would be much more to their liking, which would be one providing possibly even for increases, but in any case for no significant reduction. So I hope we will have the patience, which we've lacked all these many years, to hang in there until we can get an agreement that moves us in the direction of solving this nuclear winter problem and doesn't simply legitimize the levels of weapons that Carl Sagan deplores and that I deplore and I think we all deplore.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that completes your testimony, Secretary Pearl. We want to thank you for appearing before us this morning. And I must say that whether we agree with every jot and tittle of the administration's policy on arms control and nuclear winter, you certainly are a formidable representative of the administration here, and it's an intellectual treat to listen to you as it is to listen to Dr. Sagan. And we hope that both of you will beat you up personally, on a personal level, even before we get to the solution of nuclear arms, that you will beat your swords into plowshares and never study war, interpersonal war anymore. We thank you very, very much. Congressman Udall.
For my colleagues, for planning purposes, we have two more panels. I think what we'll do is see if we can't get the first panel done in the next 25 or 30 minutes, then come back at 2 o'clock and finish up the last panel. Unless there's some disagreement on that schedule, we'll follow it, and we'll proceed now to the next panels. Jeremy Stone, Dr. George Rathjens, Mr. Williamson, and Dr. Brody.
I think one of our next panelists has a plane at 2 o'clock.
All right.
Schneider has a backup. Schneider has it.
He has a backup plan for crazy.
What if we combine the
Sheet all wanted to come back too. He suggested we do otherwise. We could come
panels? Mo,
Yeah.
what do you think about combining the panels?
We could do that. Stay and finish it.
Yeah, just do it, knock it right off. And ask them all to summarize their testimony in 5 minutes. What if we did that? Ask them all to summarize their testimony and do.
Mr. Worth suggests, and I think I'll follow his suggestion, that because panel 2 consists of just 2 additional witnesses, we'll combine all the panels and give each of them about 5 minutes for summary remarks, and then we'll go to questions. So Dr. Carrier and Dr. Schneider, if you'll hold yourselves in readiness, we'll put you on at the end of the panel. This panel, we'll just combine the 2 essentially. Dr. Jeremy Stone, Director of the Federation of American Scientists. Dr. Stone, glad to have you here today, and you may lead off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the committee is struggling to figure out what is the new thing about nuclear winter that surely must be there that implies some change in American policy. And not surprisingly, both sides of the debate have readily agreed that the policies they were already urging in this debate are those exactly called for by nuclear winter. This should be no surprise to the congressman. There is one thing new about nuclear winter, I think, that has not been given sufficient weight by the Defense Department. And when Secretary Pearl said that nuclear winter is just a war worse than the kind we had anticipated and that it parallels their own understanding of nuclear war, I think he's overlooked one important aspect of it. And that important aspect of it is that the weapons fired at Soviet cities, in some sense, are fired against our own. So where Secretary Pearl said that there was always an interest on our part not to target Soviet cities, and that there was always a withhold mechanism to prevent collateral casualties, I think he has passed over the fact that nuclear winter provides an entirely new reason for sticking to these withholds, an entirely new reason for not firing missiles at Soviet cities. It's the cities, of course, that have the flammable materials that cause the nuclear winter. And so I think that the major new immediate policy implication of nuclear winter is great interest in both sides in avoiding attacks on cities, interests that were there in a much more passive and latent way before. And I think this is especially important to emphasize because when the time comes to attack cities by our forces or Soviet forces, the war will be well begun. And we're not even sure who will be the person that will push the button in a war in which some cities have already been attacked and one country or the other in extremis decides to fire these final options at cities of the other side. So I think it's very important that the Defense Department review the options in the PSYOP with a new eye to the direct American interests in preventing attacks on Soviet cities. Place. But a review of the war plans with regard to this new effect of nuclear winter, that attacks on Soviet cities are also attacks on our cities, that there is an important rebound effect, boomerang effect, to attacks on Soviet cities. This is something new, and this should have implications for policy, immediate implications for policy, and those implications should be reflected in much greater restraint in the war plans and possibly the removal of certain options which I think are not necessary for deterrence, but would in fact be very counterproductive for us. In particular, options to destroy the 250 smaller cities in the 300 largest Soviet cities, things like that. And